Beyond the horizon, a great creative impulse is at work, the only thing that gives this country meaning and a guarantee of the future. Every Australian ought to climb up here, once in a way, and glimpse the various, manifold life of which he is a part. Vance Palmer. Vance Palmer was a highly significant figure in Australian literature and contributed greatly to the advancement of Australian culture and identity. His role as a mentor, friend, and leader in the literature world was highly regarded by all around him, earning him acclaim from prominent writers such as A. Phillips, Harry Heseltine, and Henry Handel Richardson. Palmer's experiences as an IGS student would go on to shape his career and in turn assist the literary endeavors of IGS students in the future. In addition, through the mentoring and tutoring of young writers, Vance aided significantly in ensuring the future of Australian literature. Finally, Palmer's nationalistic beliefs and dedication to establishing a national identity influenced all Australians in terms of culture and literature. Edward Vivian Palmer had a profound and significant effect on literature in Australia in the early 1900s and influenced future generations of IGS students in their literary endeavors. Vance was a true nationalist who held significant regard for his childhood and particularly his time at IGS. Vance's adolescence, and specifically his time at the Ipswich Grammar School, had a significant effect on his literary career and assisted in shaping his nationalistic beliefs. During his time at IGS, spanning from 1899 to 1901, Vance was influenced by several significant figures. In 1899, an IGS master, Edward Wilson, was tried and convicted of the homosexual relationship with, and later murder of, a local choir boy, who was a companion of Vance's. This man's figure threw such a shadow on my first days of school, Vance states, and even now affects me with so definite a sense of evil that I cannot ignore him in any account of my youth. This direct force of evil in Vance's childhood was juxtaposed by the visit of two significant role models. In 1901, Banjo Paterson visited Ipswich. Vance could recite many of his verses by heart and describes the professional ease in which he spoke. Victor Trumper, an Australian cricketer, was also a significant role model in Vance's childhood and is described by Palmer as a figure of human perfection. Connections can be made between these important childhood figures and his future writing. Palmer describes Trumper as the foil to that of the sinister teacher. Harry Heseltine, the author of Vance's biography, reinforces this connection, stating that Palmer's career as a writer can be viewed as a continuing effort to grapple with the opposing modes of behavior represented to his youthful mind by Trumper and the sadistically homosexual master. This is best represented in his book The Legend for Sanderson, where these opposing modes of behavior are clearly present between the hero, Neil, and his rival, Besank. The lack of appreciation for culture and literature at the time of his schooling may have inspired Vance to take a strong stance in promoting nationalism and an Australian identity through his writing. Vance spoke of his schooling with considerable affection, however, felt that subjects such as literature and Australian history were not being represented equally in the curriculum. Palmer describes the library in his years while at Ipswich Grammar as a dark little room with one bookcase containing tattered novels. He goes on to state that in terms of Australian history, they, IGS boys, didn't know much about its history, for that, except in purely British Empire connotations, was a subject never taught in the classrooms. The significant figures in Vance's childhood, including famous prose writer Banjo Paterson, combined with the lack of literature and Australian culture at IGS, may have influenced Vance to write and support Australian literature. Vance Palmer was an important role model for aspiring writers, and his mentoring of young students aided significantly in the growth of Australian literature. As chairman of the Commonwealth Literary Fund, the CLF, Vance was in a position of power where he could influence and affect Australian writers nationwide. The role of the CLF was to provide financial and intellectual aid to struggling writers who may not have the ability or resources to share their work. It was also an advocate for free speech and Vance worked tirelessly to promote the board's principles and allow it to function effectively. His leadership was noted by the Prime Minister at the time, Robert Menzies, who stated that Vance's work on the Commonwealth Literary Fund Advisory Committee was greatly appreciated. In addition to the financial aid given to aspiring writers, the CLF provided money for Vance's travel expenses and thus allowed him to complete lectures in universities around Australia. This further allowed Vance to mentor young students and instill in them the importance of literature in Australia. In addition to this, Vance and his wife Nettie aided the advancement of Australian literature through their own personal letters and relationships. Vance was described as a man of letters due to his great contribution in sending and receiving letters of literature to aspiring writers. One such writer, John Barnes, states that their, Vance and Nettie's, confidence in my abilities mattered greatly in my formative years and heightened the influence of their writing on my thinking. His literary influence may have gone as far as to reach writers such as Frank Dalby Davidson, Flora Eldershaw, Henry Handel Richardson, and Xavier Herbert. His radio series for the ABC, first airing in 1941 entitled Current Books Worth Reading, went far in its appraisal and recognition of young writers. Through his commitments as chairman of the Commonwealth Literary Fund and with ABC radio broadcasts, in addition to personal letters, Vance clearly contributed greatly to the field of literature through mentoring and appraising young, aspiring writers.
I suppose the closest contacts at that time were Frank Davison, Flora Eldershaw, Marjorie Barnard, Catherine Pritchard, who lived in the West most of the time. That particular group was most predominant in the late 30s. Ellen Marshall a little later, I think. Judah Watton. And then, of course, there was correspondence with other writers who didn't live in Melbourne or near it. Xavier Herbert.
Vance was unique from other writers because he dedicated his life to the development of a national identity through various articles and books, and thus assisted greatly in changing the way that Australian culture was perceived. Through the various books and articles that Vance wrote, he promoted Australian literature and attempted to fix the cultural cringe that existed in Australia. The cultural cringe was a term coined in 1950 by A. A. Phillips in his Meanjin article of the same name, referring to the inferiority complex that existed in Australia at the time. Vance attempted to address this issue by trying to convince the public that Australians were human beings complete in all attributes, and that life in Australia had a validity and interest equaling life elsewhere. Vance aided in bringing Australian literature to a new maturity by immersing his fictional writing in Australian culture, in the process giving it an intrinsic value. The Legend for Sanderson is an example of this, containing elements of Australian culture in all aspects of the book. The overarching theme, mateship, is a fundamental part to Palmer's notion of being an Australian. Vance was also a prominent socialist and wrote several influential essays and articles attempting to create a national spirit and identity. An example of this is his article titled Battle, which appeared in a 1942 version of the Meanjin magazine. In this article, Vance outlined Australia's growing need for a national identity, while also spreading a message of certainty and hope, hinting at a brighter future for Australia. The last paragraph reflects his belief that through the hardships suffered during World War II, Australia would grow as a nation in terms of character. Vance also believed that literature was the medium required to discover a national identity, and reflected this belief in many of his books which were immersed in Australian culture. Vance also furthered Australian identity by writing propaganda for the Department of Labour and attempted to inform Australia on their past literature through books such as The Legend of the 90s and National Portraits. John Barnes states that Vance's work was an important reference in his high school Australian history course, further signifying Vance's important role in Australian literature. This significance is most clearly exemplified by the awards and accolades Vance received, such as his first place prize in the Jubilee Literary Competition in 1951, and books such as The Passage and Big Fellow were both award-winning. The Victorian Premier's Literature Award was established by a former Premier of Victoria in honour of Vance's achievements and continues to this day. A monument was also erected in Victoria to honour the lifelong achievements of Vance and his wife Nettie. Vance clearly had a significant effect on the development of literature in Australia through his unwavering teachings of nationalism and by assisting in the creation of an Australian identity through literature, which was badly needed at the time. Vance's mentoring and sponsorship of young writers and his significant role in creating a national identity affected the future of IGS students considerably, particularly in terms of literature. Through his involvement in the Commonwealth Literary Fund, Vance may have indirectly affected another prominent IGS old boy, Thomas Shapcott. In addition to receiving financial aid, Shapcott mentions that an influential writer was sent to Ipswich by the Commonwealth Fund under Palmer's authority. Palmer's fondness for his childhood home, combined with the influence of Banjo Paterson's visit on his younger self, may have led him to view Ipswich favourably in terms of Commonwealth funding, and in turn affect IGS writers such as Shapcott. In addition to this, conclusions can be drawn between the similarities of Shapcott and Vance's literary careers. Both Vance and Shapcott were renowned for their poetry, and both served at the head of the Commonwealth Literary Fund, which was under the name of the Literature Board when Shapcott was in charge. Without Vance's previous successes in both these fields, which paved the way for future writers, Shapcott may not have achieved his own successes. In addition to this, the Vance Palmer Golden Pen Award, presented at Speech Night at Ipswich Grammar School, continues to inspire and influence young writers to achieve success in literature. In a general sense, Palmer affected the future of IGS students through his part in the creation of Australian culture and identity and the furthering of literature in Australia. The IGS library was a dark little room with one bookcase during Vance's time at IGS. However, today, a new, modern facility now marks the IGS library, offering thousands of books and a wide range of literary content. This new appreciation of Australian literature can be attributed to writers such as Vance, who dedicated their lives to the promotion of Australian literature. Genius is often seen in extremes, but Palmer deliberately tried to depict the ordinary. He was the artist of the usual, the illuminator of the everyday. Harry Heseltine. Vance's time at Ipswich Grammar School was an important part of his life, providing him with an education and exposing him to many important people that would later affect his literary career. Evidently, Palmer was a significant figure in the field of literature, and through his unwavering dedication to Australian literature and culture, he affected Australian identity and how Australian culture was perceived. This is best exemplified in books such as The Legend for Sanderson and articles such as Battle. In addition, Vance's steadfast determination in mentoring and assisting young writers through his own personal letters and through his involvement with the Commonwealth Literary Fund clearly reflects his significance in literature. Through his teachings, Vance affected many important Australian writers, such as John Barnes and Henry Handel Richardson. Vance's effects also extended to Ipswich Grammar in the form of the Golden Pen Literary Award, which is presented yearly. Clearly, Edward Vivian Palmer had a profound and significant effect on literature in Australia in the early 1900s and influenced future generations of IGS students in their literary endeavours.